The dramatic developments unfolding in Sri Lanka are being watched very closely in India. According to Wion sources, the internal developments in Colombo, so to speak, are being watched with concern, particularly as the sacking comes just a week after Ranil Wickremesinghe visited New Delhi. Over the last few weeks, it was becoming increasingly clear that President Maithripala Sirisena and Ranil Wickremesinghe had fallen out. Ranil Wickremesinghe was opposed to the increasing influence of China and was seen as close to New Delhi. Even the United States of America, too, has reacted over the dramatic sacking of Ranil Wickremesinghe. The State Department of the US has tweeted, and I quote, "We call on all parties to act in accordance with Sri Lanka's constitution, refrain from violence and follow due process. We expect government of Sri Lanka to uphold its Geneva commitments to human rights, reform, accountability, justice and reconciliation." The US has also urged political parties in Sri Lanka to abide by their constitution. And we have our principal diplomatic correspondent Siddhant Subal now joining us live from India's capital, New Delhi, with the latest. Siddhant, talk to us. We do understand that New Delhi and not just the MEA, the entire administration is closely watching the developments in Sri Lanka.
Well, whether it's New Delhi or whether it's Washington, everyone is closely watching what is happening in Colombo because it has been a night of dramatic development. We saw the state television also. It was showing color bar for a few hours also late last night. But that said, we have seen America, of course, expressing its concern, saying that the situation should not spiral. And of course, we know that the now former Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has said that he is still the Prime Minister and he has the support in the Parliament. He has called it the entire development as unconstitutional and illegal. The Finance Minister has called it as a coup, and his party, Ranil's party, has called for an early session of the Parliament, and for that the Speaker will be making the decision for calling on the Parliament. That will be important because in the Parliament we do expect a floor test to take place in the Sri Lankan Parliament, and of course both the sides will be asked to prove the majority. But of course this is a decision by the President, and we know the tiff was happening between the President and the Prime Minister, and especially so yet only last week Ranil was in New Delhi. He had talks with the Indian Prime Minister, and before that we saw that report coming that Indian spy agency wanted to assassinate the president. So this was a tiff which was happening, but nobody expected this kind of development to happen just overnight. The big concern is now about Rajapaksa. He is considered a China man. We know how earlier he was a big headache for New Delhi, but only 1 month ago he was here in New Delhi along with a BJP minister. So that person had a meeting also, a big meeting also, in which Rajapaksa talked about how close Delhi has been to Colombo. So Rajapaksa is one person who can, in a sense, give some kind of headache with New Delhi, but many are saying that New Delhi has already tamed him. But given the fact that situation in South Asia with Maldives already in big mess, and now Sri Lanka falling, how big it will be a mess for New Delhi, and how China would like to exploit the entire situation, particularly with its growing inroads in the entire region, whether it's Islamabad, whether it's Male, or whether it's Colombo.
Siddhant Subal, our principal diplomatic correspondent, joining us, and this is Wion's continuing coverage of the political crisis in Sri Lanka. Now we're being joined by Professor Rajiva Vijayasena, former State Minister of Higher Education, joining us live from Colombo. Mr. Vijayasena, thank you so much for being with us here on Wion World is One. These developments, Mahinda Rajapaksa, there are concerns when you see him at the helm, and there are concerns from India, from New Delhi, as to why Ranil Wickremesinghe was sacked overnight in such a dramatic fashion. How much do you think this is a worry for India that it's now Mahinda Rajapaksa who is the Prime Minister?
Well, I don't think India should worry at all. After all, as you just said, Mahinda visited India recently. Subramaniam Swamy is very positive about Mahinda. Obviously, I don't know whether he exercises any influence, but he's certainly been watching Sri Lanka more closely than many people. And I think he understands this country very well. Sri Lanka obviously wants to be very pally with India. I think during the last years of the Rajapaksa regime, there was a falling out, which was a great pity. I think the fault was more ours than yours, but I think India also, the Prime Minister in 2012 should have followed the advice of the Foreign Ministry and not supported the Americans against us. But you have to remember that all this talk of China is really nonsense, because Hambantota was, as you know, offered first to India, which turned it down. They may have a good reason, but the then Indian High Commissioner told me later he thought they'd made a mistake. And of course, under Rajapaksa, the Chinese demands were moderate. It was only after this government came in and really bankrupted the country because of some, the central bank fraud that the Prime Minister and his chosen governor perpetrated. The country was in such desperate straits that rather foolishly, I believe, and Mahinda Rajapaksa said the same, they actually gave the harbour to China on a 99-year lease, which is unthinkable. And I'm really rather sorry that India did not at the time register that this was upsetting. I mean, I'm not saying that obviously India has a veto over such things. If Ranil Wickremesinghe and his sidekick Malik Samaravikrama decided to give it for 99 years, that was their business. But India should not have continued to indulge Ranil Wickremesinghe.
But Rajiva, the question always comes back to China and India, because even in this particular instance, this dramatic overnight sacking and replacement, in that saga, there's all that talk of the fallout between Ranil Wickremesinghe and Maithripala Sirisena over India's proposal for a seaport.
Well, I think it is a bit much of Ranil Wickremesinghe if the President and the Minister of Shipping suggest that, India has the West Terminal if they wish, for Ranil to say, no, I promised India the East Terminal. These things cannot be decided by the Prime Minister without at least consulting the Minister of Ports and Shipping. Mahinda Rajapaksa, who's a very able man indeed, and frankly should have been our Foreign Minister instead of, this chap called Tilak Marapana, who's a disgrace. Mahinda Rajapaksa came in a very difficult situation when the UNP had actually settled the 99-year lease with China. And Mahinda has tried to do a good job. And I think it's outrageous that the Prime Minister should assume that, all the ministers will do what he says and claim that he had promised the East Terminal to India. I mean, that is nonsense. The situation arose, if you remember, because the Minister of Ports and Shipping brought forward a proposal that Sri Lanka should develop the East Terminal, not China, I should add. Right. And then Ranil said, no, I promised India. You can't behave like that.
Right, Rajiva.
He was not elected president. The chief executive of the country is the president.
Rajiva, the state of play is such that China right now has the Hambantota port to itself for the next 99 years. India, if you're saying that, should have registered its own sense of being perturbed at that stage when Hambantota was handed over. India didn't do that, but India tried to get its own port, to get its own strategic interests, and with its ally Sri Lanka, long-term ally Sri Lanka. But the way things stand, the state of play is that China has Hambantota, and now India does not have this port, and that has led to a fallout. And then you have another man
two wrongs do not make a right.
A China man who is going to be the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka going forward.
Mahinda Rajapaksa is not a China man. He is first and foremost a Sri Lanka man. It just so happened that after the war, during which India helped us enormously, and I think Mahinda Rajapaksa should have kept being grateful to India for its support. So did China, but India was, in fact, our prime supporter at the time. Unfortunately, for various reasons, the West applied a lot of pressure. And because India, some people in India wanted to go with the West, I don't think our foreign ministry did. They are much more sensible than that. We found ourselves in a bit of a difficult situation. As I said, I think Mahinda Rajapaksa should have tried much harder to keep on good terms with India. I think it's a great pity that good relationship was disrupted. But two wrongs do not make a right. And just because Ranil Wickremesinghe and that horrible Malik Samaravikrama gave the port to China for 99 years, India can't say we also want our port. India should at the time, as soon as it was announced, have registered its displeasure so that Mahinda Rajapaksa and Maithripala Sirisena could have actually renegotiated. Now Sri Lanka has offered India the West Terminal. India should take it. I think there's a lot of things that India can do with us, and I hope very much that Mahinda Rajapaksa appoints a decent foreign minister whose first initiative should be to mend fences with India. Because don't forget Maithripala Sirisena's initial manifesto said very much he believed in a foreign policy in which our neighbor came first. And it was really unfortunate that India, because of a couple of your high commissioners who tended to, go along better with Ranil, kept saying Ranil calls the shots. But electorally, it is the president who calls the shots. And I do hope that relationship will develop.
Rajiva, even if I were to buy your point that it's India's a question of India's timing and India's intent towards Sri Lanka, even if I were to buy that point, the cloud of using Chinese money for election campaigning hangs over Mr. Mahinda Rajapaksa.
Well, there are so many rumors. The New York Times article was written by people who were very bitter about Mahinda Rajapaksa even before, the Sri Lankans, before the election. You know what the New York Times is. It's a Hillary Clinton, broadsheet. But as you know perfectly well, in 2014, there were a lot of people who spent a lot of foreign money, mainly American. I won't say anything about India. India is not as blatant as America, but I know perfectly well the Indian High Commissioner at the time. He was a good friend of mine. When I resigned from this government, he told me that the biggest mistake they made was allowing me to go. I went on an issue of principle. They wanted Rajapaksa out. There was a lot of manipulation behind the scenes. I mean, you have to accept that a lot of countries interfere. And of course, China, being very sensible, ignored the insults that this government flung at China, not Maithripala Sirisena, but Ranil Wickremesinghe, Manga Samaru, the finance minister at the time. And China just bided its time until the present government turned to it in desperation. And then they screwed us. They absolutely screwed us because a 99-year lease is not a good thing. I thought it was shocking that this government should have agreed. Mahinda Rajapaksa said so at the time. But of course, none of you guys bothered to say anything at the time. And I think that type of, laissez-faire attitude to the Ranil Wickremesinghe government was really very regrettable. There should be some matters of principle on these issues. India, as a good friend, should have at least in private pointed out that this was not acceptable behavior.
Rajiva, it's interesting how you keep pointing the fingers at India as if the onus lies in India for the goings-on in Sri Lanka. Right.
I'm not pointing the finger at India, but I'm saying that you guys at Wion are trying to create tensions between India and Sri Lanka over China. And if such tensions were genuine, then they should have been taken notice of earlier, not only now.
All right.
You have to remember that Sri Lanka would like a policy in which India is our best friend. And as I said, I hope that can be developed. But we are not here to kowtow to anybody.
All right. Rajiva, stay with us. Let me quickly tell the viewers who've just tuned in why this new development in Sri Lanka matters for the entire region. It's likely to shift the strategic balance in the region. China may get a bigger play in Lanka again. At least that's a possibility. Most Tamil people of Tamil ethnicity, consider Rajapaksa as a war criminal. And the sacking of Ranil Wickremesinghe comes days after Wickremesinghe travelled to New Delhi. Now, China got a strategic entry into Sri Lanka under Mahinda Rajapaksa. Hambantota port was eventually leased out to China under Rajapaksa. Chinese submarines docked in Lanka under Rajapaksa. Rajapaksa met India's Prime Minister Modi in September, notwithstanding. Rajiv Vijayasena, if you were to put all those facts together, would you still say that we are exaggerating this entire China angle to the proceedings? We are, at the end of the day, putting out facts there and see what it means.
No, it's not a fact. When the Hambantota port was leased to China under this government, Hambantota port was built by China under the last government. The last government asked India to build the Hambantota port, and India said no. I was a close friend of the then Indian High Commissioner. We had a High Commissioner called Alok Prasad, who was very, very good. His successor, Ashok Khan, whom I was very fond of, was a very sort of, I would say, proper man. He told me later, his staff did, we had a very good political analyst at the time here, who is now your ambassador in Ethiopia. And they told me perhaps they made a mistake. But India, they also told me India moved very slowly. We had asked India in when Rajapaksa was in power in about 2005 or 6, and India had agreed to develop the Kankasanture port in the north, they did nothing about it until China started doing Hambantota. Now, maybe you can blame your bureaucracy, but you can't attack Sri Lanka for getting help where it needs if you're not prepared to do much yourself.
Right.
Now, it's certainly true that after the present election, and indeed in the previous days, India did give a lot of support. I used to try to tell Kantau to, make sure that he levered properly, but he tended to be, as I said, very, very proper. And the result is that, for bad reasons, we fell out. But certainly, I think your effort to now say India should be worried should have been made at the time Malik Samrik made this outrageous deal with China,
Rajiv, I'll tell
which
you
upset
this.
us as much as it upsets you.